Hello, welcome. It's a pleasure to introduce today's program, The Fight for Clean Water, which the Whitney has organized in collaboration with the Natural Resources Defense Council. My name is Christopher Liu. I'm the Nancy and Fred Poses curator and curator of Choir, the new installation that artist Pope.L has created for the Whitney, which is part of a trio of exhibitions that we did in partnership with the Public Art Fund and the Museum of Modern Art. Choir continues Pope.L's exploration of water. The piece, which is located in the lobby gallery and closes today, uses water as a sculptural and sonic material, cycling 900 gallons of water through a network of pipes. The drinking fountain suspended from the ceiling makes reference to Jim Crow segregation, while the title suggests a collective project. In 2017, Pope.L addressed the water crisis in Flint. He collected tap water from a home in Flint and brought it to a Detroit gallery, Wet Pipeline, where an installation functioned as a bottling factory, laboratory, pop-up shop, and group exhibition all at once. The gallery sold Flint water as individual bottles and box sets as an art multiple. All the proceeds were donated to the United Way in Flint and other local nonprofits. We're proud that cases of Flint water are part of the Whitney's permanent collection. As we were working on Choir last summer, news broke about the contamination of the drinking water closer to home in Newark, where Pope.L was born and raised. And the exhibition seemed like an opportunity to bring attention to the ongoing struggles across the US for clean and safe drinking water. I want to thank the NRDC for partnering with us for this event and sharing their expertise with our audiences. I'm particularly grateful for Elizabeth Carr, and also wanted to thank my colleagues in the education department. And I wanted to invite all of you for a reception that will take place after the event up on our 8th floor, so please join us up there. And we can continue the conversation as also to celebrate the incredible work that our speakers are doing. Now I'll turn things over to Mitch Bernard, the Executive Director of NRDC, and he'll speak more about their work and introduce the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. A special thanks in these perilous days for coming out and joining us today to talk about extremely important and timely issues concerning drinking water and justice, environmental justice. I'd especially like to thank the Whitney for creating a platform for us to talk about these issues, and also just want to point out that some NRDC supporters and trustees are here, and I want to send special thanks to them. As Christopher said, I'm Mitch Bernard, the Executive Director and Chief Counsel of NRDC. For those of you who aren't familiar with NRDC, we've been around for 50 years. We were formed in 1970. We're an environmental advocacy organization, and we're based here in New York City. We have around 700 staff people now around the country and around the world working on environmental issues. And we have scientists, lawyers, policy experts, communications experts, and others. And what we're trying to do at root is to ensure the rights of all people to clean air, clean water, and healthy and thriving communities. In 1970, when we started, the main task was to enact fundamental environmental laws, which NRDC helped to do. We helped to draft the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. Part of the idea of NRDC, this kind of nonprofit for the people environmental group, also was to enforce those rights, because when rights exist in a statute, they often don't mean that much unless you can enforce them, and often that means enforcing them in court. We have strong litigation capacity to this day. To date, we have filed 104 lawsuits against the Trump administration, trying to fight the onslaught of rollbacks and rescissions of regulations and rules that protect the environment and human health. That's one lawsuit for every 10.88 days since the inauguration 3 years ago. And we've won 90% of those cases thus far. And the reason we bring these cases and fight hard to prevail in court is because we're not going to sit by while protections for the planet and for the people who inhabit it, including people in communities like Flint and Newark, have their rights, their environmental rights, their fundamental freedoms to clean air and clean water and healthy lives stripped away by a government that is callous to those rights. We also have a long history of collaborating with artists and cultural organizations like the Whitney. And that's extremely important because to prevail on the issues that we're concerned about, it's more than a statute or a lawsuit. It's a matter of the hearts and minds of people. It's a matter of persuading people that these rights are fundamental, and we all have to stand up together and fight for them. And of course, people connect to the arts in this deep and personal way, and that depth is very, very important to stimulate social action, political action, which we're trying to do. They're part of a dialogue that generates activism. So we are very proud and happy to collaborate with the Whitney and other cultural institutions to drive cultural change, the change that's necessary to protect all of us. Pope.L has certainly contributed to that conversation about environmental justice and racism. I think the mainstream environmental movement, which has been around since Earth Day in 1970, has done a lot of wonderful things. One thing I think it hasn't done enough of is fight for justice, is to recognize that there's such a thing as environmental racism, and that the inequalities that we normally associate with issues like income and housing and education also apply to environmental issues. Why does this drinking water problem occur in a place like Flint or in a place like Newark? It's not a coincidence. And so the environmental movement, NRDC in particular, is moving more and more powerfully into the realm of justice. And that, to me, is an extremely inspiriting development in the environmental movement. Because it's a fight for everybody, not just a few. So I want to thank the Whitney and Pope.L and all of the artists and cultural institutions that are part of this ongoing struggle against environmental injustice and inequality. And we're very grateful to be engaged in this dialogue with you today. So again, thanks for being here. This is a very distinguished panel filled with some of my colleagues. And the moderator I now want to introduce, technically on the organizational chart, I supervise her, but on these issues, she supervises me. NRDC's Chief Equity Officer, Urena Mujica.
Great, thank you, Mitch. And thank you again to the Whitney for hosting us today. Today we're going to talk about, as you've heard already, we're going to talk about the relationship between race and water quality, structural inequality, the right to safe water, and the power of people to create the change to ensure that we have safe water in our communities across the nation. We'll tackle water and law, public health, water as a basic need, and the plague that's infecting Flint, Newark, and many other communities across our nation. You'll meet today on International Women's Day 3 incredibly inspiring women who are bringing their passion, their hope for a better future, their expertise, and the lessons that they've learned to share with us here today. We'll talk about hope, we'll talk about engagement, and we think that you might not ever think of a glass of water quite the same way again. So with that, I'm going to ask each of our esteemed panelists to introduce themselves, maybe give us your name, where you're from, and what brought you to this issue.
All right, thank you. It is so wonderful to be here with all of you. Thank you to the Whitney and thank you to NRDC. It's always a pleasure and a privilege to partner with, especially the NRDC. So my name is Mona Hannah Atisha. I am a pediatrician in Flint, Michigan. I have the everyday privilege of waking up and caring for our beautiful, brave, brilliant, resilient children in Flint. And today my work is all about making sure that they not only recover from our crisis, but thrive. I was one of the folks that helped uncover the crisis. I did the research on the blood of our children that noticed that there was this increase in lead levels only in Flint kids and nothing happening outside of the Flint water limits. I now spend so much of my day making sure that no other community has to go through what Flint went through. And I think that Flint has shined this incredible spotlight, just like that one that is shining on me right now, but really an incredible spotlight on our nation about how we need to do better, especially when it comes to our drinking water, our public health, and the promise of our children.
Hi, everyone. My name is Yvette Jordan. I am a teacher in Newark. I'm a history teacher, actually, in Newark. And I'm here for several reasons, one of which is I am a homeowner in Newark. So when I found out about our crisis there in terms of lead and water from NRDC, I was surprised and shocked. I'm also a member of a organization, New Caucus, who is a group of educators, and we were informed from NRDC about elevated lead levels. So I am really extremely concerned about myself, my family, of course. However, I am also worried about my students. And when I explain what is happening, unfortunately, my students aren't as aware, and educating them has often felt like a uphill battle, really a challenge for me. So I'm excited about the opportunity. I am thankful for NRDC inviting me and Whitney for having me as well.
Hi, my name is Dimple Chaudry. I'm a senior attorney with NRDC, and I'm here today giving the perspective of a lawyer on some of these issues. So I first started working on these issues about 5 years ago when community groups in Flint reached out to NRDC to ask whether we could help them understand what was happening with their drinking water. This was before Flint was a national story and a national conversation around contamination in drinking water. And NRDC took that inquiry, and we, with an amazing team of litigators and all sorts of advocates across the organization, helped build a case, a legal case, a litigation that we filed in 2016 that resulted in a $100 million settlement to get Flint's lead pipes out of the ground. And so we are in the process of still implementing that settlement, and we've also been helping a lot of other communities, including Newark, fight in court for their right to water that's free from lead contamination. And so I'm extremely honored to be with Yvette and Mona on this panel and look forward to our conversation.
Great, thank you. So I know we're here to talk about water, but let's start with lead. What is lead? What does it do to our bodies?
That's a great question. And we've known about lead for a long time. It's probably the oldest and most well-studied poisons. It's a neurotoxin. So it attacks your nervous system, and especially the developing nervous system, which is our youngest children. We had widespread use of lead. You guys tell me, what did we put lead in back in the day? Gas. Paint, gas, what else? Pipes, not as much pencils as more graphite. But yeah, so we put lead, even though we knew it was toxic even like a century ago. We put lead in paint, we put lead in gasoline, and we put lead in plumbing. And industries all made significant profit out of the application of lead and have largely been held unaccountable, even to this day, of the application of lead, even though they knew it was toxic for our most vulnerable children. So incredible science has taught us, especially over the last decades, that we now consider that there is no safe level of lead. And why do we say that there's no safe level of lead? It is because what it does to children. It impacts cognition, which means how they think. It lowers IQ levels at a population level. It impacts behavior, leads to things like developmental disorders, attention problems, focusing problems. It's been linked to things like attention deficit disorder. Impacts hearing and growth. And kids exposed to lead as adults can have things like early dementia and high blood pressure and gout, and the list goes on and on and on. Because of this incredible science, which we didn't even have to do but has been done, we now recognize that there is no safe level of lead. And as a medical public health kind of society, we should be practicing something called primary prevention, which means never exposing populations to lead because of what it does to developing children especially. Great policies have come into play, especially over the last few decades, that have decreased children's lead levels, as it was much worse, for example, in the 1970s when we had widespread use of lead in gasoline and paint. But at the same time, even though those levels have come down, the science has once again taught us that no level is safe, and every level has been shown to have deleterious impacts. We also very clearly know that it is children who are already suffering with so many toxicities of life, be it poverty and racism and lack of transportation and crumbling schools and lack of nutrition and healthy food, that it is these same children that also have pre-existing higher rates of lead exposure. So kids in Flint already had higher lead levels, just like kids in Newark and Chicago and Baltimore and Philadelphia, because of legacy lead from layers of paint in older homes and paint and lead in soil. Even though we stopped using it, it still is throughout our environment. So it's a well-known form of environmental injustice impacting kids who already have all these obstacles to optimal health and development.
Thank you. It sounds pretty clear that we should have, as you've said, this should be something that children are not at all exposed to. How did this get into our drinking water? How does the lead come into people's homes and into people's drinking water?
Great, I'll just real quick. So where's like young people who took high school chemistry? Like, what's the elemental symbol for lead? PB, so it comes from the Latin, which means plumbum. So lead actually means plumbing. So the word lead means plumbing. I went to Pompeii, Italy last summer, and you could actually see the old lead pipes perfectly preserved. And there's strong theories that that hypothesize the demise of the Romans is because they used so much lead in their plumbing, but they also used it as like a food additive and stuff. So not a good idea. It's really sweet. So we've been using lead in our plumbing for a long time. It's malleable. It persists. It doesn't corrode as bad as other metals. So it's been used for a very, very long time. And since it started being used, there's been lead and water problems. Flint, I testified a couple weeks ago in Congress about the lead and water rule. Flint wasn't the first time this happened. It wasn't the last time it happened, and it wasn't the worst crisis. Washington, D.C. had an even worse lead and water crisis over a decade ago. And since Flint, obviously, we've had more lead and water crisis. So lead was allowed in our service lines, which are the pipes that go from the water main to the front of your house until 1986. Most communities stopped putting lead pipes in, except for Chicago. They were still putting them in until 1986. But lead wasn't restricted in our fixtures and our faucets, like from our taps, until about 2014. So there's lead and water throughout our nation's plumbing, which is like plumbing means lead, so now you know. And the laws on the book, specifically the lead and copper rule, never intended us to get lead-free water. They tried to incorporate treatments called corrosion control to minimize lead in water, but we were never really as a nation intended to get lead-free water. The rules on the books are very weak.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, one thing to clarify, I think it's an important clarification, is that your source water typically doesn't have lead in it. So if you see a water utility or anyone step up and say, well, our source water, our reservoir water is clean and it's safe, that doesn't tell you anything about whether you're at risk of exposure to lead. You get lead in your drinking water when it comes through the pipes, right? So it's after it leaves the water treatment plant, it's running down the pipes, down your streets and into your homes. And so I think that's an important distinction. So as Mona said, the primary source of lead in drinking water, one of the sources, is that service line that runs into your home. It basically runs from your front door or wherever your water line comes into your home into the street. And if you're in New York City and you're in a big apartment building, you may not even know where that is. And if you're in a very large apartment building, it may be less likely that you have a lead service line, but we can go into that later. But just because someone tells you, oh, our reservoir water is clean, that tells you nothing about whether you are at danger or your children are at danger of lead exposure.
Can you talk a little bit about, you've mentioned, this is clearly not just Flint and not just Newark. How widespread is this? And specifically, which communities are typically burdened by lead exposure?
You want to start? I think you have a thought on this.
Yeah, I do. I think what they call EJ communities, which are environmental justice areas, really are communities where folks are not empowered. And unfortunately, many times it's communities of color. So what happens when a factory is near you, or when somebody is dumping near you? All of these things affect you. And unfortunately, that is how communities of color are affected. So I think in Newark in particular, and I tell my students this, I've used examples and said, okay, so in the South Bronx, in Flint, in Newark, so many factories. How about in New Orleans? What happened after Exxon Valdez? All of these other things, and environmental impacts of all of these issues. I mean, it's a myriad of negative things, and all of these are happening, and unfortunately, residents are not aware, number one, and unfortunately are not rising up.
You've touched on many of the other factors that are also burdening oftentimes these communities. Can you talk a little bit about how those often come together? I'm thinking about, for example, water affordability issues, the water shutoffs that were happening at the same time as part of the Flint water crisis. How does that sort of combine in those areas?
I'm curious to hear what the others think on this, but I can give you kind of one example of how at least it's been that intersection between affordability and safer water at least plays out in my mind as a lawyer. So, if you bring a case against a water system, the goal is to get the lead pipes out of the ground. If it's about lead contamination, you want those pipes to come out. You want people to have access to safer water. That's not free. That costs money, right? So who's paying for those pipes to come out of the ground? If you're suing a water system that is already cash-strapped, is already poor, it's already serving a high proportion of low-income residents who are struggling with all these other environmental injustices, and then you say you win and say you get a judgment where, okay, water system X, you have to pay, $100 million or tens of millions of dollars to take your pipes out of the ground. Who ultimately bears those costs, right? So it's the people through their water rates. And I'm giving you the example of a litigation, but you have to be mindful about who is going to bear the ultimate cost of the fix. And that's why, at least, at NRDC, we have a lot of different advocates who are pushing for massive investment at the federal and state level into our water infrastructure. And I know, Mona, you've advocated and talked about this as well. It can't just be that poor people have to pay for this for themselves. That is the ultimate injustice, the idea that these communities that are already overburdened, that have been lied to, that are being given toxic water, then have to have their water bills go up through the roof in order to pay for the safe water that they deserve. And so, fighting for improved investment in water infrastructure across the board and making sure that money is prioritized in Black and brown communities is extremely important. But it's a hard issue. Water affordability is, I think, one of the key questions. How do you balance that against, I don't know if it's balance is the right word, but how do you keep that in mind when you are advocating for some of the changes that we need?
Yeah, I would just add that was one of the greatest ironies in Flint. Before we were a water quality issue, we were a water affordability issue. The people of Flint were paying the highest water rates in the country for water that they could not consume. And because the water was so expensive, people would conserve, right? Which is the exact opposite thing what we're supposed to do with lead and water. You're supposed to flush. You're supposed to flush the water through your system to get all the contaminants out. And this was happening in Michigan. Any Michiganders out there? Oh, you go. So we're the Mitten State. Like literally surrounded by the largest source of fresh water in the world. So the Great Lakes are the largest source of fresh water in the world. And to this day in Flint, and even more so in Detroit, we have water shutoffs because of affordability. This was just in our kind of Michigan papers this week and has become a heightened issue with the coronavirus issue, because what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to wash your hands with water, right? And we continue to have, this population of folks that are, underserved in so many different ways that still do not have access to water. And as a doctor, this is a medical and public health necessity. We need clean, safe drinking water to survive. And to this day, it's not a right. The United Nations was involved in Flint and Detroit because of that basic denial of access to water because of the affordability issues.
Great. So, we've referenced a lot of different tools, science, law, activism, medicine, art. When do you, when you think about sort of which tool to use in which situation, how do you sort of effectuate change using each of these different mechanisms?
Who wants to take that? I'll start. I think that all of them are equally as important, and you need pressure in so many ways. For example, when we came here and we had a tour of the exhibit downstairs, it was really, really powerful. And I think everybody learns, as an educator, I know everybody learns in various ways. So I was really struck, and I can see if I have my students here, they also would be. However, if you're thinking of science, and Mona, I'm sure she will address this, that's a whole world. And in terms of art, my students, in terms of actually showing their feelings about lead, has come out through art. So I think all of these things are equally important, impactful, rather.
I would totally agree. I think for all of us who want to effect change as activists or to influence policymakers, we have to have a lot of different tools in our pocket, because some are going to work for some folks and some are going to work for other folks. In the very beginning of our work in Flint, when we were trying to draw attention to this, I would have my PowerPoints and my graphs and my spreadsheets and my statistics and my numbers and my p-values, and that was great for some people, but not most. So even when we shared our research at our initial press conference, I had a picture of a little girl and she had a name, and I shared her story, and then I also actually held up a baby bottle filled with Flint water, and that was the optic that captured the media and allowed us to kind of elevate the story. I've sat in many of an offices of policymakers, and sometimes it's that one story that finally convinces them that they want to care about this too. We need to have lots of different tools in our pocket, and just like your students in Newark, our kids in Flint, art has been cathartic. We've had so many different plays and poetry and songs and books and documentaries and all these different artistic expressions that have helped convey this story in many different perspectives.
So one of the, I think, exciting things about being a litigator in this space is kind of helping, is using the different perspectives and like the people on the stage, right, to pull together an effective, compelling case that might convince a judge that, what's going on is indeed a travesty and a violation of the law. So for example, Mona's research that showed, a doubling of blood lead levels in Flint's children, elevated levels of lead in their blood was, one of the centerpieces of our initial kind of court filings in our case, highlighting, look how urgent this is. This is a public health emergency. Judge, court, you need to intervene. We need immediate action now. And that was that was her medical research, her scientific work informing our legal strategy and our legal arguments. And Yvette is, the New Caucus is one of our clients in our Newark litigation, again involving safe drinking water, violations of the Safe Drinking Water Act and elevated lead levels there. And our activism and the activism of New Caucus, I mean, they are the clients in the case. They are, they are the heart of the case. They are the ones who are bearing the brunt of these legal violations and are informing our legal strategy and helping us form it. And so I think when you think about that, for me, one of the exciting things about being a litigator is taking those other people's incredible, their use of their tools and kind of incorporating them into ours. And I'll just say one other thing that kind of strikes me about this question is that when we first were contacted by community members in Flint about potentially helping, it was because they were trying to figure out what tools they could use to effectuate change. They had already been, challenging their local elected officials to help them, challenging state officials to help them, asking everybody they could to say, hey, we know something's wrong with our drinking water. We know this is making us sick. What can we do? And that kind of, I think, persistence and heroism to say, I'm going to ask everybody, what can you do in this situation? To me, that was really powerful as well, to say, okay, we want to know, what can you do as a lawyer? What are the legal tools you can bring to bear here? And I was, our team was so happy that we could say, okay, we think we have one. We think we have an idea here. And it was, the Safe Drinking Water Act, which is the federal law that's supposed to protect us from lead contamination in our drinking water. And it doesn't do a great job of that in some instances. And here was one where we could say, okay, this water system is violating the law and we think we might be able to help. And so I feel like in that way too, just kind of having these really incredible community activists and residents thinking about all of the different tools that they can use as well sometimes helps bring people like us together.
If I can just add, I would totally echo what you just said regarding the tool of having a multidisciplinary team. So the Flint story is about an unexpected team of folks that came together, moms and activists and pastors and journalists and scientists and students and doctors, like everyday people who came together and said that, hey, something is wrong. And they were so much more powerful together. So it is absolutely a testament to the idea that individuals working together can make a difference. And those tools were every single skill set at that table.
Thank you. Yvette, I'm going to direct this question to you, and certainly others from their own perspective can jump in, but I'm interested in, from Newark in particular, as a community member fighting for safe water today in Newark, can you tell us a little bit about some of the barriers that you're facing, that you have faced, with a history of disenfranchisement in Newark perhaps, and how that's sort of playing out?
When you talk about barriers and challenges, I think in Newark in particular, it's, for those of you who know Newark, our mayor is someone who is really loved. And so for us, it's been a challenge when government officials, we think, okay, here is what is happening and we have a problem. So I think for myself and for other activists, it's a challenge in any community when you're trying to effectuate a change and it seemingly is an uphill battle. And it's always an uphill battle, especially when residents, as several residents in my neighborhood, are feeling, okay, everything is fine now. We need lead service line replacement and we're getting it. Everything is okay. So for me, challenges are educating our public, educating our youth, educating the parents, and self-advocacy is so important. And especially in an issue such as this, it's like, as we say, water is a human right. However, unless you stand up and say water is a human right, nothing changes. So unfortunately, in my community where so many people are bogged down with the vicissitudes of life, you're worried about, oh, I've got a job and I have all these kids and I've got to worry about X, Y, and Z, and now you're telling me I've got to worry about water as well. So for me, I think a barrier is at times ourselves. And when I say ourselves, I'm talking about the importance of saying what we need. And so many people are really disenfranchised and never stand up for themselves. And this is just one more thing. So, in a nutshell, that's it.
Mona, how would you like contrast that with what's going on in Flint? You know, it strikes me, having worked in these communities, that it, in some ways it's the opposite, right? There's like a lack of awareness. Maybe there's a lack of a sense of urgency, but maybe it's a little bit different in Flint.
Yeah, so very similar issues. I mean, in Flint, we have a 70% child poverty rate, like, you know, one of the most violent crime rates in the city, high unemployment. Like, we started our recession before everywhere else hit the lowest. It hasn't recovered. So many, like I said, toxicities that make life difficult for our families. Every day in my pediatric clinic, about 30% of my patients don't show up. And it is not because they do not love their children as much as every single one of us love their children, but they have every obstacle of poverty to get to what they need. And I don't blame them. Our water crisis was on top of decades of crisis, decades of greed and capitalism and racism and neglect. And then this crisis happened on top of this, you know? And we have folks in Flint who also feel the same. They're like, oh, I was, you know, who feel like this was almost all purposeful, like a genocide. Like they meant to, you know, this was the next thing they did to try to kill us off. And, you know, who've been, you know, have had these feelings of neglect and injustice throughout. And this was just another even, you know, clear, visible example of overt kind of racism and injustice. So there's a lot of folks who feel that way too, who very much still to this day feel the everyday trauma of the crisis, which was the water crisis, but even bigger than that, and much like Newark, it was a trauma of betrayal, where folks that you thought were supposed to keep us safe and healthy, that our tax dollars actually pay, did the exact opposite and covered it up. So they're still dealing with those feelings of betrayal and anger and fear and guilt and anxiety and stress that can also lead to poor health outcomes. But then again, we also have folks who I think speaks to a lot of kind of Flint's history of resistance and disobedience and loyalty and pride and grit, who have rolled up their sleeves and have committed to moving forward. And most importantly, on behalf of our children. We've launched something called the Flint Registry, which is this massive CDC-funded effort to follow folks, but make sure they're getting connected to things to improve health and development. We've learned a lot from the World Trade Center registry folks here as well, but it's very different. It's a public health registry. And we have done this all in a very kind of community-partnered, community-informed, and community-driven way. And when we were coming up with kind of the branding of this registry, because the word registry is really scary, like I'm going to be on a list, where's this list going to go? Is ICE going to be involved? Like it's scary to be part of a list, and what does that mean? A Flint resident suggested the idea of using the logo to be the mythical Sankofa bird. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that. It's this mythical bird from Ghana that is flying forward, that is looking back, and it is holding an egg in its mouth. So it is all about pushing it ahead. What can we do next? How can we make sure that tomorrow is going to be better than yesterday? Looking back, never forgetting the injustice, which also speaks to the need for things like accountability, and never kind of forgetting the past. And that egg in the mouth is all about the kids. You know, how do we do this on behalf of our children? So that is one of the reasons I love being in Flint, and why I fell in love with that city over 20 years ago, is because of this sense of moving forward, leaning on that history. History is important, right, history teacher? History is really important. We step over history every day, and we do a really good job closing our eyes to history that we don't want to pay attention to. We need to know and understand the history if we absolutely want to move forward.
I just want to underscore what Mona was talking about earlier when she said about coalition building and what she said now. I have learned so much from her, and students are learning also from her students as well. Well, not your students, I'm talking about young people in Flint. So I think it's important for us learning about self-advocacy, also sharing experiences as young people are in Newark and in Flint, and having dialogues with each other. So all of that is just so important, and unfortunately, it's not happening enough.
So I'm gonna keep talking about that because it's my favorite thing that's happening. So we have a group called our Flint Youth Justice League. So it's a group of kids, like our Kids Advisory Council, and in the spirit of being community driven and having the importance of self-determination, we meet routinely with kids who tell us what we should be doing. So it's really hard because I have to close my mouth and not stop talking. But the kids really drive these conversations. And so our Flint kids have been like Skyping with kids in Newark, and they've been sharing tips on how to raise their voices and how to organize and how to be advocates. So I let this serve as another example of the power of our youth. I mean, to this day, if you think about the big things happening across the world, it is really very much being driven by our youth. So it inspires me every day.
That's great. You know, as I listen to these stories and all of the lived experience that you all are bringing, I feel so inspired, right, by what you're describing, by the work that you all have done, but also by, you know, how the communities are rising up and you know, finding their power. I also feel so outraged, right, that this even has to happen over and over again. And I wanted to ask you if you would maybe talk a little bit about sort of how does this work affect you personally, and how do you sort of cope with just the everyday challenge of it?
I think it overwhelms you, obviously. And if you care, and I know each of us care, you take it home, you think about it, you wake up at 2 a.m., 3 a.m. thinking, okay, how do I strategize and how do I help so-and-so and so-and-so? Or in my case, how can I educate my students so that they learn and really advocate for themselves? It's very difficult, very, very difficult. And at the same time, I've got to do it. And I think each of us feels we must. And that's why I think, so my husband's here somewhere, and he's probably saying, okay, what are you going to do next? And I'm sure it's about EJ. And I say, of course it is about EJ. It's about environmental justice. And how come nobody else is screaming about it? So for me, it's extremely emotional and personal.
Yeah, I would echo that, and I think, you know, as a lawyer, I think there's an expectation that you'll keep a critical distance, right? You're the calm and composed one who's in court, kind of the mouthpiece for the case and building the litigation, and you'll keep a little bit of distance from the issues and from maybe your clients. I think with this work, that's impossible. What Yvette said really resonated with me, taking this home, thinking about it all the time, waking up in the middle of the night. We were talking earlier, and I was sharing that, you know, when I first started working with community members in Flint, I had just had my second son. He was 4 months old, and he was born with some health challenges. And so, you know, I came back, and anyone who's had a baby know when you come back with a 4-month-old, you're maybe not, you know, there's a lot going on. So, you know, then to immediately be, tasked with or asked to figure out whether there might be a case here to bring on behalf of this deeply wronged and traumatized community that was experiencing just this horrific, these horrific things, was so emotional. You know, I would leave my baby, go to Flint, spend, days and days and days there talking to people, talking to mothers who would cry to me about worrying that they were poisoning their babies, who are also 4 months old. And you just think about it and you're like, what, first of all, the rage, right? Like, what is happening? Like, how can this be happening? And then the motivation that you take from that, which is like, and that is why I will wake up in the middle of the night and I will not sleep and I will do everything I can to help. So I think, at least for me, from that perspective of the lawyer, it was impossible to keep a critical distance, but I think it ultimately was for the better of our advocacy work collectively. We were all so outraged and motivated because it was, it's an uphill battle.
I guess I would just echo all that. It was and it continues to be consumptive. It occupies my days and my nights. Many a dream was consumed by this, and waking up like, oh my gosh, what's the next step? How can we do that? Who should I call? I would be drafting emails in my head at night about like, who can I reach?
Be sending emails in the middle of the night too.
Like, what's the next step? But it also, like, for me, it was a choiceless choice. Like, of course, this was my work. Of course, this is what I'm going to do. Of course, this is my next step. There was no other option. And I think for me as a pediatrician, like, I literally took an oath to protect and speak up for children. But I think implicit in this is that we all have taken an oath whenever, and we all should be advocating, especially for our most vulnerable children. This is all of our job, doctor or teacher or lawyer, whatever our profession. So what you touched on earlier, we talked a lot about kind of the resilience of these folks in these communities who have, despite all these obstacles, these multiple toxicities and stresses and injustices, have risen up and have overcome and are trying to overcome. And that's I say that a lot. I talk about the bravery and the resilience, especially of our Flint kids, and how they're leading the way. And then I recently read a book, There. Anybody read that book, There, by Tommy Orange? It's a really great book. And there's a beautiful line in that book, because we also often, it's about Native Americans in Oklahoma, and we also often talk about the Native American community as being really resilient, despite being oppressed and being killed and, being displaced, they continue to be very resilient. And then we also, here we are, International Women's Day, we also talk about a lot of women. Like, women have also been very resilient despite, having that foot on their neck for so long, and, the effects patriarchy, all these different things. I continue to be resilient, and we'll continue to run for office, and hopefully we'll have a president one day. Anyways, that's a different story. But anyways, so then there's a line in the book There that says, why, like something like, why do you praise us as resilient? Like, why do we have to be resilient? Like, why do we have to be under so much injustice? Like, why? So, like, as this kind of public health person who always tries to look upstream, like, why? Like, yeah, it's great that we are resilient and we are brave and that people continue to fight, but why? Why do some people and some populations and some places have to be more resilient than others? And I want us to think about that. Like, why do we have these disparities that continue to persist and to put people down?
So one of the things that I have really enjoyed about having the opportunity to moderate this panel, and just the few minutes that we had before this panel, it was so clear how much sort of just amazing energy these three women bring together. You've all worked together in a number of ways for years now. Can you talk a little bit about sort of what inspires you about each other and what you've learned from each other? Go, Yvette!
I want to go first. So when I met Mona, she came over to my house, actually, and her energy, she's just so warm and bubbly. And so she is warm and bubbly. She is also smart and caring and really in this fight. And I think it resonates. It just really comes out of her. And so anytime I think of her, I can call her up, and she is right there and helpful with advice. So for me, Mona epitomizes somebody who is an advocate, who cares, and is not dumb.
Thank you. We're not allowed to hug, but I want to hug. Okay.
And in terms of Dimple, I remember I met her in court, and somebody said, I think it was Nancy, you said, oh, she is a rock star. I said, really? And she really came across as somebody who also cared. She wasn't on our team at the time. However, she cared. She was knowledgeable, helpful. And I really appreciated that. And I don't know if I ever said that. Thank you for me and for New Caucus. Thank you.
So we talked about like this team of folks. And I think before all this, as a pediatrician, a medical educator, I used to live in a silo. Like, even though I very much understood all these other kind of, socioeconomic, historic factors that impact the lives of my patients, I used to think that that as a pediatrician, we kind of had a monopoly on caring for children. Like, there's nobody else in any other profession that cares as much about kids as we do as pediatricians. And I have so enjoyed being proven wrong time and time and time again, because it is Yvette and Dimple and so many others that remind me that this is work that we can only do when we're doing it together, that when we are humbly shoulder to shoulder working together to do this work. And I have been honored and privileged to have all these new friends who once again, their nights are consumed by this work, who treat these kids just like our kids, like there's no different, and who have my children, when I'm not home, they're like, oh, mom's with our 6,000 siblings. So it is no different for these amazing women who also have been not only fighting, they've been fighting for all children. So it has been a privilege. Dimple's like my sister, like we kind of look alike too. So we have some cute photos together. So it has been an absolute privilege to call these folks partners in this work.
What else is there to say? But I'll try. I'll say one thing. So Mona and I have been working together for years now, and I feel like she has been this kind of North Star for us as we've been navigating so many different things. NRDC is a big NGO. We are not a local grassroots organization based in Flint, working in Flint. And
you're not? What?
Yeah.
Seems like
I know
it.
sometimes, but no, and we shouldn't pretend that we are, right? We are not that. We are something else, and we have a role to play, and we can be helpful, and we can be respectful partners, and we can, work to promote the priorities of our local partners, but we are not that. And so talking to people who live in Flint, who work in Flint, who treat the children of Flint is extremely important for us to both understand what is happening on the ground and make sure that our priorities are reflecting the priorities of the community that we're working in. And there's a lot of people that we talk to in order to try to do that. Our clients, first and foremost, in this case in Flint, we represented a group of pastors, Concerned Pastors for Social Action, which is a group of Black pastors in Flint who have been long advocating on social justice issues. And they were really at the first wave of the water crisis there, because their congregants would come to them and say, water is making us sick. And they didn't have any experience with what they ultimately started to call their water ministry, but they got that experience and they became really fierce advocates. We work with a woman called Melissa Mays who lives in Flint. She's just this fearless mom who has been a real advocate for Flint residents. So there's so many people that we talk to and work with, and a whole host of other folks on the ground. But Mona has been, as I said, kind of this guiding light for us to help us make sure that our priorities stay reflective of what the community wants. And that's not always, it's hard. We'll say that. And then Yvette, I spent a lot of my time working on our Flint litigation and now our settlement enforcement. I mentioned earlier that we have a settlement to Flint's lead pipes replaced. We're overseeing that settlement. But another amazing team of litigators at NRDC works more closely with Yvette on our Newark litigation, which is a case that is in some ways similar to the case we brought in Flint, but in many ways is different. And so Yvette's name kind of her reputation preceded her. And we heard all these stories about this amazing advocate, this amazing teacher who was kind of leading the charge for our clients in Newark. And so it was, when you have a client like that who's clearly so passionate, clearly so educated, clearly so invested, and just, so willing to do the hard work that it takes, because it is hard to be a client. It's not easy. we think about, the lawyers kind of standing up in court, it is even, obviously these folks are living this day to day, so that's one hard part of it. But even being a client in a legal case is actually extremely difficult. And so I just really, Yvette is just, to me at least, is so like symbolizes and is and embodies kind of that really incredible, effective advocate who is willing to sacrifice so much for her community. And it's because of people like Yvette that we can do this work and that we can be more effective. So, there's so many people. It's not just us on this stage, but it's really, it is really just, it's been such a privilege and an honor to work with these women and so many other people who have kind of helped in this fight.
That's great. Maybe a closing question. We've talked about clearly the amazing work that you all have done, the work that the advocates, the folks in the communities, how they've advocated and come together. What can individuals do, folks that are worried that this might be an issue in their community, folks that are interested in helping to make sure that this issue is addressed wherever it is coming up? What would you recommend to folks that are asking, what can we do? What should we be doing?
Vote. 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 Vote for folks who respect science, who respect public health, so that we can be more proactive and preventative rather than reactive, which we often find ourselves in. Vote for folks who recognize the issues of equity and justice, and that these are cumulative impacts, like Yvette talked about earlier. These are communities that are suffering from many things. So vote, 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 vote. Give to the NRDC. Can I say that? Give to the NRDC. NRDC. Like when I was, I have done environmental stuff before, and there was just like one of those environmental groups out there doing great things. Like, who knew what they do? And like, oh my God, they do so much. And we would be nowhere in Flint without the NRDC. So if this story moves you, and they did not tell me to say this, if this story moves you, give to the NRDC. Like, doing real work in so many communities, making the lives of children better. So thank you to the NRDC.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, if you have any skill, and I remember speaking with somebody about a week ago in church, and I was talking about self-advocacy, and she said, I want to do something, it's just, I don't know what I should do. So if you have any skills in terms of explaining how to stand up for yourself, something as simple as having a conversation with somebody about how to do that, something so simple really impacts somebody and will help. And unfortunately, in this fight, everybody's got to stand up, and there is power in numbers. So if you have a skill about sharing how to fight, how to write, how to make a call, if you have an elected official, okay, here is what you say if you make a call. Something as simple as that, I think, is important.
So I have a more mundane initial response, which is that check your water for lead. So find out if you have a lead service line. You can do that it depends on where you live, but you can do that if you have a basement. Go into your basement, see if you can figure out where your pipe is coming into your house. See if you can figure out if you have a lead service line. Even if you don't know, put a filter on your tap. A properly installed and maintained faucet filter that is certified to remove lead is extremely effective in protecting yourself and your family from lead exposure. We heard what Mona said about how even small amounts, no amount of lead is safe. Even small amounts can have really serious health impacts. So, start at home, think about yourself, think about your family, and protect yourself. The other thing I would say about it is, be an ally to other communities. I think that there are ways to do that. Donating to groups who are doing this work. Also donating to kind of frontline groups who are doing this work, right? Local grassroots groups who are really trying to, they are the first wave of this. And so, figuring out who those groups are, either in your community or in another community that may be experiencing these types of water crises is extremely important. And I think that, I don't know, I think that in whatever way you interpret being an ally, if that's, donating, if that's giving some skill you have, if that's donating your time, whatever you can do, we need it.
Thank you so much. Just, huge gratitude to our panelists for sharing their experience and their knowledge with us today. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
So we'd like to now open up questions to the audience. There is going to be a mic that gets passed around, so just raise your hand if you would like to ask a question. Okay. I see one back here and then another one up there.
Hi, thank you all for all your hard work and dedication to this really important problem. My question is, where are you today in both Newark and Flint with the replacement of the pipes? How many need more to be replaced, and where is that?
So I can talk about that for Flint. So I mentioned a lawsuit that we filed in 2016. The goal of that case was to get Flint's lead pipes out of the ground and implement some other health protections, but that was really the centerpiece of what we were looking for. And we reached a settlement with the state of Michigan and the city of Flint in 2017 to do exactly that, to get Flint's lead pipes out of the ground. So we've been, for the past 3 years, overseeing the implementation of that settlement. Right now, as of maybe 2 weeks ago, that's my last data probably, more than 20,000 pipes in Flint have been investigated to determine whether or not they're made of lead or galvanized steel, which also presents similar health risks to lead. And so there have been 20,000 homes in Flint that have had their pipes examined and looked at, and close to 9,000 pipes have been replaced. And so that's incredible progress. Getting those pipes out of the ground is one of the main things we can do to protect Flint residents moving forward. There's still some work to go. So over the next 3 to 4 months, we expect that project to close out and for all of Flint's homes to have been investigated for lead pipes and for whatever pipes that have been found to be removed. In Newark, the situation is a little bit, is in a slightly different place. I don't know if you want to talk about that, Yvette.
The city identified about 18,000, and so far 9,000 have been replaced.
And I'll just chime in on that. We have an ongoing lawsuit involving New Caucus in Newark, and that the terms of that are that the issues around that are still being litigated. So there are some open questions there that that will be hopefully resolved in court.
So there's about estimated 10 million lead service lines in the country. Nobody really knows because water utilities don't have a great inventory of that. There's only 2 other cities that have fully replaced their lead lines, and that is Madison, Wisconsin, and Lansing, Michigan. Flint will be the 3rd. Many more cities are now following suit. Learning the lessons of Flint, Michigan passed a model lead and copper rule, which exceeds federal standards, which mandates all of our lead pipes in our state are replaced within the next 20 years. We're trying to get that kind of language into the federal rule, which was really missed that opportunity. But the ripple effects are tremendous. Many more communities at the local level, state level are investing in this, but we do need national investment in replacing these lead service lines.
Hi, just an additional note on what Dimple said about getting tested. If you're in New York City, you can call 311 and get a lead test sent free to your home. So do that.
Mona, do you want to?
I would just nuance that, but sampling is really variable. So you can sample a tap multiple times and get multiple different readings. If you do, the best way to protect yourself is to know if you have lead in your, as a lead line, or if you assume you have a lead line, or if you have lead in your fixtures, and that was all fixtures could have lead in them before 2014. To protect yourself, just use a point of use filter. Sampling and low levels on samples can provide a lot of false reassurance, but there's a role. But if you fully want to protect yourselves, I would recommend a point of use filter, and they're certified by the National Sanitation Foundation, NSF.
Yeah, so thank you very much. And you did touch upon the intersect affordability in clean water, but you didn't speak so much about affordability, like first and foremost getting clean water to be available for people. I'm wondering if you can talk about, so like I'm living in Detroit right now, and these conversations that you mentioned about public health and not having access to clean water because people can't afford it, and all of these narratives of personal responsibility, which are kind of hard to take when like some place like Nestle has, for $200 bought a permit and is selling for millions the water per year. But yeah, I'm wondering if you've done work on affordability, that being the next step, like what can we do?
Yeah, absolutely. And the same week that the state of Michigan cut off our bottled water supply for Flint was the same week that they granted Nestle essentially unlimited access to Great Lakes water for $200 a year. And they had 80,000 comments. The folks that said you shouldn't do this, and they still did that. So once again, example of putting profits over people. Which was also the case in Flint, where it was all about austerity and saving money over the health and the public health of people. So the affordability is a huge issue. It's a huge issue, like again, and so ironically, in Michigan and Detroit, in the middle of the Great Lakes. And I think these are conversations that we have to have as a society. Is this a public good? Is water a public good? Or is it something that only those with privilege can afford? And what's a compounded issue when we have any kind of infectious kind of virus or anything going around, this is only going to exacerbate these conditions. And once again, a community of folks who maybe have even harder access to get health care as well.
And just to chime in on that, one thing that's interesting about Flint, with regards to our case in particular, so we secured $97 million to replace Flint's lead pipes. That's coming from the state, not from the city, right? So the state there, and there are reasons why the state is responsible, for that, but the state will be footing that bill. That's not the case, that may not be the case in other cities, that may not be possible in other cities. So this question about affordability is important. NRDC does do a lot of work on water affordability, that we have like great policy advocates who have been trying to more deeply understand this intersection that you're talking about. But one example, maybe it's a small example, but one thing that I've found to be interesting and effective is just making sure that we're coordinating. There are a lot of advocates in the water affordability space, and making sure that when we're working with community groups, we're looking at it from all angles. So for example, in Pittsburgh, we work with the community group there, and we have a case involving lead contamination in Pittsburgh's drinking water, but we're also working with affordability advocates there. So we have a dialogue about how do we balance the things that we're pushing for, right? If we're pushing for something that may be a costly remedy, what do the affordability advocates on the ground there say about that, and how prioritize that piece of a remedy? And so I think making sure you're having that dialogue. Now that's a small reactive kind of response. I think the bigger piece of it is that we shouldn't have to balance these things, right? We shouldn't have to be worrying about that, and that comes into when you talk about state and federal investment in making sure everyone has clean drinking water. Yeah,
if I'll just add, since we're talking about dollars, when we talk about the need to do pipe replacement work, people are like, we can't afford that. That is so expensive. It's maybe up to $10,000 per pipe, to replace those lead pipes. We cannot afford that as a nation. There's been some great work out there by economists who've looked at the costs of not doing that. And there's a great report that came out after Flint from the Pew Foundation, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, that looked at the cost of doing lead elimination work, not just with pipes, but also with home abatement, and have put the dollar bill at about $80 billion that we would save our nation every year with costs that we're not spending on, for example, special education or criminal justice or healthcare or behavioral healthcare costs or decreased economic productivity. Just in Flint, we have this little group called Flint Lead Free, and we are doing a little economic kind of cost benefit of our work. Of the 9,000 lead pipes that have been replaced and about a couple hundred homes that have been abated, that's already saved us about $53.3 million in these societal costs. So we have to start speaking with these dollars too. We can't just say, oh, it's good because we're supposed to do this. So we are also trying to get the cost of inaction of not doing this.
I see a hand over here in the back, or sort of in the middle back.
Thank you so much for doing this. Hi, Yvette. I'm Yvette's neighbor in Newark, and also a community activist. And I should commend every single one of you. You've been doing some wonderful job. And also, I've been working on the water issue and the whole water issue back with the Pequannock when Cory Booker was in office. Not a fan, and because of all the corruption that was going on. And so I agree with every single thing you said in terms of it has to be a multi-pronged strategy, and then also with the self-advocacy, because Newark, we are bombarded by so many different issues. And I don't know how many of you know that also Agent Orange, with the diamond alkali, was fabricated in Newark. So with the Passaic River, it was also contaminated, so we had to help clean that up. And so one of the first things that my husband and I did when we moved to Newark, because we were sort of aware of environmental issues, especially around EJ communities, which are environmental justice communities, usually people of color in low-income communities. And then we went and we changed our, we added water filters. We didn't change the pipe, but we added water filters, whole house, and then also kitchen. And so it is sometimes frustrating to work with representatives, because they are dealing with, with people who we are bombarded. We are sick and tired of everything that keeps happening. And a lot of it, those of us who work with the community, we are aware of. And so when things like vote go out, yes, absolutely, we need policy, we need legislation. And I'm also a co-chair of the Newark Environmental Commission. And so we enacted, we got the city council to enact in 2016 the first ever in the nation EJ Municipal Cumulative Impacts Ordinance. And so all of us, we have to band together because, you're paying lip service. What then? Because it's not just in the water, there's lead also, because Newark is surrounded by the ports, the airports, so there's lead in the paint, as you mentioned, the ports, the diesel, everything, and then the long-term cost. How do we deal with that? So has anybody really started to think about it? Because I remember reading with Flint, about Flint, and they said to change, I think a few years back, it was like $500 and something million. And then with, when we were dealing with Booker also, he said like $556 million to change. And lo and behold, it cost $120 million. So who are we to trust, and how are we supposed to go about, fixing it? Because the long-term cost, we haven't seen it yet in terms of the behavior, the health cost, what's going to happen with that.
Good comment.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, that was awesome. You're amazing. Amazing neighbor. Wow. What kind of water?
There's nothing
Just
to say in response to that.
We agree. California, I know, is also doing really great work around cumulative impacts. So it's really what you touched on and what Yvette touched on is these are neighborhoods that have so much other badness that's happened just in terms of environmental exposures. I mean, Flint was the birthplace of General Motors. There's all this legacy manufacturing. Our Flint River caught on fire twice in its history. I mean, there's all this other stuff that we don't even know about, and we know that hasn't even been studied. Now we have PFAS in our water too. So that we have to be able to recognize this cumulative burden. It's not just one thing, it's many things. And that's just like environmental stuff, not the other kind of injustices that are impacting families.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. We're going to take one here in the front.
Hi, I'm Emmeline. I'm here live streaming for NRDC, and we have a question online from our Instagram audience. Someone asked, what can Newark residents do to get real oversight and transparency over the lead service line replacement program?
I would say that, New Caucus and NRDC are in court right now fighting just for that. Join our fight would be one thing I would say. And then ask the questions. If you're a Newark resident, continue to ask the questions of your local officials. Put pressure on folks to get the information that you're looking for. So, for example, with a lead service line replacement program, you want to know, when are they coming to your house? What kind of instructions are they leaving after they change your pipes? For example, you need to flush your pipes after you have your service line replaced to make sure that all of the debris and lead and kind of particulate lead gets out. Making sure that, the city is giving people instructions on that. Making sure you have a properly installed water filter after your service line is replaced. These are the kinds of things that you want from a good surface line replacement program. And I think residents asking in any city that's replacing pipes, asking, are you taking these health protective measures? If not, why not? And figuring out, what they can do to continue to put pressure on local electeds to be more responsive is critical.
So I'm going to once again share that because NRDC sued and has a settlement in Flint, there's all these criteria that have to happen in regards to oversight, transparency, and it gives us such a peace of mind that there's this third party watching over everything to make sure that it's being done the right way. Because you could have politicians come and go and other city managers or whomever saying, oh, we're going to do this, we're going to replace all your pipes, and we're going to do this, and it's going to be fine, we got the dollars, blah, blah, blah. But having NRDC in charge of everything is thank you. It's awesome. It's like a fact check, It's like, oh my gosh, it makes everything so much better.
I appreciate that, but I'll also say that I don't know if we're in charge of everything, but to the I think this question's point, we're the information on the ground, from our local partners, is the information that we use in order to enforce these legal obligations. It's the information that anyone can use to put pressure on their local officials to make sure that these pipes are being removed in a health protective way.
Thank you again. Unfortunately, I think we're out of time, but I hope you'll stay and join the panelists and all of us for a reception that is taking place right upstairs to continue this conversation. Please also stop by the NRDC table on your way out to learn more about what you can do. And we also have copies of Dr. Mona's book, What the Eyes Don't See, A Story of Crisis, Resistance, and Hope in an American City, available for sale for those that are interested. Thank you again for coming, and thank you again to our panelists, to the Whitney for hosting us. Happy International Day of Women, Women's Day.
The reception will be on the 8th floor, so please join us up there. Thank you.